Poštovane koleginice i kolege, dame i gospodo, čast mi je i izuzetno zadovoljstvo da otvorim svečanu promociju počasnog doktora Univerziteta u Beogradu, na koje će, na predlog Naučnog veća Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju od 11. aprila 2018. godine i odluke Senata Univerziteta u Beogradu od 11. jula 2018. godine biti promovisana dr. Judith Butler, profesorka na Univerzitetu u Kaliforniji iz Berkeley. Sada ćemo poslušati studentsku himnu. Welcome, Professor Butler. I shall continue, sir. Molim direktora Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju, doktora Petra Bojanića, da naše drage i uvažene goste bliže upozna sa biografijom profesorke Judith Butler i da u ime predlagača obrazloži predlog instituta o dodeljivanju počasnog doktorata. Izvolite.
Poštovana i draga rektor Popović i profesor Judith Butler, dame i gospodo, dozvolite mi da u ime Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju pročitam nekoliko reči na ovom jeziku o profesorki Judith Butler i kratko obrazloženje. Sastavila ga je svojevremeno Adriana Zaharijević. Zašto je institut predložio da se Judith Butler dodeli počasni doktorat Univerziteta u Beogradu, a sve istog univerziteta to prihvatio. Pre toga nekoliko reči na engleskom jeziku. On behalf of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, allow me to thank Judith Butler for accepting this honor of being part of the University of Belgrade, for being with us, for being one of us. Today is a high holiday, an important day, and I am particularly glad Judith is spending it with us in Belgrade. Dear Judith, although there will be few in the audience who are unfamiliar with your work, allow me to say a few words about you in Serbian, giving the reasons we have nominated you to this honor conferred by the university. I recall that Albert Camus said something about there being nothing more meaningless or absurd than listening to a foreign language. Then it must be even worse being spoken about in a language one does not understand. But as English has not yet entirely taken the place of the Latin, in which this laudatio ought to be read, the university is after all still universitas, we have the language understood by the majority in this hall. I promise to be brief and precise. Judith Butler je redovni profesor na Univerzitetu u Kaliforniji, Berkeley, na kojem predaje od 1993. godine. Njen istraživački rad odvija se u polju kritičke teorije, političke filozofije, studija roda i etike. Butler je rođena 1956. godine u Clevelandu, osnovni i postdiplomski studij filozofije završila na Univerzitetu Yale gde je doktorirala 1984. godine. Njena primarna interesovanja u periodu studija kretala su se u polju kontinentalne filozofije. Napisala je doktorsku tezu o Hegelu, a njena prva knjiga Subjects of Desire iz 1987. prilagođena disertacija obrađivala je Hegelovu recepciju u Francuskoj 20. veka. Pored nemačkog idealizma i fenomenologije, Butler je u to vreme takođe bila pod snažnim uticajem frankfurtske škole i taj će se interes ponovo ispoljiti u njenom kasnijem radu od 2000. godine nadalje. Butler je osnivačica programa kritičke teorije na Univerzitetu u Kaliforniji Berkeley, trenutno rukovodi projektom koji finansira fondacija Andrew Mellon, a čiji cilj je formiranje i razvoj međunarodnog konzorcijuma programa u oblasti kritičke teorije. Bila je šefica katedre odseka za retoriku u periodu od 1998. do 2003. i od 2006. do 2007. kao i odseka za studije roda i ženske studije od 2002. do 2003. godine. Predsjednica je odbora Centra za istraživanje humanistike Univerziteta u Kaliforniji Irvine. Predsjednica Komiteta za akademsku slobodu i članica izvršnog odbora Asocijacije za moderne jezike. Judith Butler je dobitnica više prestižnih nagrada, od kojih ćemo navesti samo nekoliko. Nagrada Andrew Mellon za istaknuto postignuće u polju humanistike 2009. do 2013. a Dornova nagrada 2012. za doprinos feminističkoj filozofiji i filozofiji morala, nagrada Brudner za životno delo University Yale, profesura Albert Magnus grada Köln 2016. dobitnica je brojnih stipendija Guggenheim, Rockefeller, Ford, Američki savjet učenih društava, Institut za napredne studije Univerziteta u Princetonu, Ekonoman Superior u Parizu, itd. Održala je brojna priznata predavanja, među kojima su Belek, Kerkner, Watts, Gauss, Tanner, Freud. Proglašena je počasnim doktorom na univerzitetima Bordeaux 3, Paris 7, McGill, St. Andrew, Freiburg, Buenos Aires, Liège, Costa Rica. Judith Butler spada među najvažnijim imenima savremene kritičke teorije, a njena dela su imala značajno udjelo u formiranju novih i razvoju postojećih disciplina. Iako su uvek kretala u polju filozofske refleksije, njene knjige i tekstovi omogućili su ukrštenje različitih filozofskih pravaca, ali i nefilozofskih i filozofskih polja mišljenja. Knjige su prevedene na više od 20 jezika, od čega je na srpski jezik prevedeno nekoliko njenih najznačajnijih knjiga koje su joj donale svetsko priznanje. Judith Butler je prvi put posetila Jugoslaviju krajem 70. godina 20. veka kao Fulbrightova stipendijskinja zainteresovana za francusku školu i njena razna evropska uobličenja. Prema vlastitim rečima posebno je zanimao demokratski socijalizam i način na koji ga je artikulisala praksis škola. Bliskost sa beogradskim praksisom i veze koje su načinjene tokom ovog boravka na našem tlu osvedočene su u časopisu Praxis International, u kojem su objavljeni neki od prvih tekstova tada mlade filozofke. Njeni kasniji radovi, posebno oni iz druge faze, odnosno posle objavljivanja Nevolje s rodom, knjige koje je prevedene u Sloveniji, Hrvatskoj, Crnogori i Srbiji, ostavili su dubok trag na razvoj discipline studija roda u Srbiji i regionu. Judith Butler je posetila Beograd u novembru 2015. godine u organizaciji Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju, kada je bila govornica po pozivu na konferenciji Kako delovati zajedno, How to Act Together. Njeno predavanje, održano u bioskopskoj sali Kulturnog centra u Beogradu, okupilo je 900 ljudi, a seminar u njenoj najnovijoj knjizi bio je povod da se pozovu neka od najvažnijih imena u zemlji i regionu, kako bi se približila ondašnje razumevanje njenog dela. Od tog susreta njena saradnja sa Institutom za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju se intenzivira. Od kada je u decembru 2016. godine odobrena 4-godišnja stipendija Mellon fondacije, IFDT učestvuje u stalnoj razmjeni informacije o organizaciji događaja u okviru konzorcijuma, u čiji je rad uključen od samog početka kao referentna tačka na Balkanu. Saradnja koju je Judith Butler do sada ostvarila sa Institutom za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju i koja će se nastaviti u budućnosti, u velikoj meri pomogla da se IFDT smesti na svetskoj mapi programa kritičke teorije i na taj način bude prepoznat i uvažen ne samo od evropskih i severnoameričkih kolega, već i od kolege iz čitavog sveta. Bila nam je čast zbog svega navedenog predložimo da profesorki Judith Butler, jednom od najznačajnijih svetskih intelektualaca današnjice, kako zbog doprinosa kritičkoj teoriji i političkoj filozofiji i studijama roda, tako i zbog intenzivne saradnje sa ovdašnjim teoretičarima, pre svega sa Institutom za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju Univerziteta u Beogradu, dodeli zvanje počasnog doktora, doktor honoris causa Univerziteta u Beogradu. Hvala vam.
Hvala doktore Bojaniću. Stigli smo do tog svečanog trenutka. Ja vas molim da svi ustanete. Poštovane koleginice i kolege, dame i gospodo, čast mi je da na osnovu predloga Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju i odluke Senata Univerziteta o dodeli počasnog doktorata Univerziteta u Beogradu za doprinos društvenoj teoriji i studijama roda, njihov razvoj u Srbiji i saradnju sa Univerzitetom u Beogradu proglasim profesor dr. Judith Butler za počasnog doktora Univerziteta u Beogradu. Čestitam. Par reči, iako ne znam koliko je umesno da jedna inženjerka priča o filozofkinji, ali dozvolite mi tu slobodu, par minuta, da kažem kako smatram da je vreme dolaska profesorke Butler u Beograd, imajući u vidu sve izazove sa kojim je suočena autonomija univerziteta, ne samo u našoj zemlji, ali i globalno. To predstavlja jedan veliki podstrek i podršku da mi istrajemo u tome da Univerzitet u Beogradu sam rešava svoje izazove i vrlo smo zahvalni što je našlo vreme da dođe u Beograd. Sa druge strane, njene oblasti interesovanja su za nas izuzetno zanimljive, znači prevazilaze daleko samo partnerstvo sa Institutom za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju. Kao zemlja koja je imala različite odnose prema studijama roda i bavljenju rodom, mislim da je takođe njeno prisustvo ovde vrlo korisno da bi Univerzitet u Beogradu i drugi univerziteti u Srbiji se bolje suočili sa izazovima rodne ravnopravnosti u akademskoj sredini. Mislim da smo nedovoljno svesni značaja ovog pitanja i da pitanja koje su vezana za rod ne postavljamo samo u ravan da je to naša obaveza prema našim međunarodnim partnerima, nego da je to egzistencijalno pitanje za postizanje maksimalnog učinka Univerziteta u Beogradu i njegovog doprinosa ovom društvu. Sledeći mnogo širi aspekt je doprinos društveno-humanističkih nauka, posebno humanističkih nauka, na razvoj Univerziteta u Beogradu i društva uopšte. Zbog zaista sve rastućeg većeg jaza između tehnološkog i društvenog razvoja, pomoć i podrška onih koji se bave humanističkim naukama je neophodna da bi se taj jaz smanjio i da bi bolje razumeli izazove društva u kojem živimo. Tako da mislim da uz pomoć prijatelja, dobronamernih i uz neverovatan ljudski potencijal koji postoji na Univerzitetu u Beogradu, možemo dobro da rešimo izazove koji su pred nama, da postanemo dobar primer kako se u jednom tolerantnom dijalogu razlike mogu rešavati u našoj zemlji i verujem da je ovo i prilika da opet naznačimo koliko su važne partnerske institucije, što akademske, što druge u regionu i u Evropi sa kojima Univerzitet u Beogradu sarađuje da bi svoje ciljeve realizovao. Hvala vam na pažnji i sada bih pozvala profesorku Butler da uručim diplomu počasnog doktora Univerziteta u Beogradu i zatim da je pozovem da se obrati skupu i da poslušamo predavanje na temu Critique, Dissent and the Future of the Humanities. Dozvolite da profesorki Butler uručim diplomu. really an honor. Would you like to see it? Yes. So I'll do this. Thank you very much for coming this morning. I am most pleased and honored to be here in Belgrade and to address you today on the occasion of this honorary degree. I am most grateful to Rector Popovic and also to Petar Monic for inviting me and for making possible this event. As you know, Petar is known for his generosity as well as his profound intelligence, and I am grateful for his company and his support. I've been lucky enough to know several members of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, a unit which has contributed in significant ways to the international consortium of critical theory programs, of which I am the current director. The Institute has distinguished itself for its contemporary engagement with some of the most important questions of our day, showing the urgency of thought in the midst of times that are too often defined by reckless action and destructive policy. So I am honored to receive this degree from you especially, but the only way I can accept it is by understanding that now I belong to you in some way, and that our work belongs together. So yes, you honor me here today, and for that I, the singular being who I am, is most grateful, especially because you know my flaws and you have seen my errors. So thank you for accepting my flawed humanity, such as it is. It is made all the more bearable by the following thought. If you honor me, you honor also all those who have made my work possible, and that includes all the interlocutors, all those who have left their books, both the living and the dead, with me. So if I am to receive this honor you give me, then I must also pass it on to all those who have made my thinking possible, who inhabit my thinking like ghosts or like angels. So I thank you. We thank you, all of us who are absent and present, who receive and pass along this honor for work that requires collaboration, requires a debt to those who precede us, and a gift to all of those who follow us as they find their own way. Perhaps on this day we can reflect together on the humanities, for we are living in times in which there is increasing skepticism about its value. Is it useful? What are its effects? Can study in the fields of the humanities secure your employment? When we ask about value, we tend to ask about use.
But we are also asking about market value, of values that are spawned by markets and enter into our everyday language about what has value or what will bring value. Perhaps one way to answer this question is to engage in an act of imagination about the future of the humanities. Can we imagine it? And can we imagine it together? And are we already working within the humanities when we start to imagine in this way? Of course, this question is linked to a separate question. How do we imagine the future? Can we even imagine the future? Or has the future become the name for what can no longer be imagined, or perhaps what could never have been imagined? Is there, for instance, something of the unimaginable in any possible future we might talk about? If that is true, then that seems to be precisely because the future is not fully predictable. Perhaps we can predict with some sense of confidence what the future may hold, but it will never be the case that the future will be fully predictable. And when that unpredictability disappears, so too does the future. So we might, under conditions of climate change and increased militarism, the destruction of the rainforests and the intensification of poverty and precarity, of violence against migrants, women, trans, come to the conclusion that there is no future, or that the future looks to be simply a reproduction of violence and inequality. But if we say that, we have given up on the future, for we have taken the present moment, one part of the present moment, and generalized on the basis of that moment, allowing that moment of political despair to determine our sense of time and extinguish our sense of futurity. If we ask what future can we imagine for the humanities, then we are asking what kind of future can be imagined, and we are also presupposing that futures are imaginable. Once we ask how the future is imagined, or through what means, or by what forms the future is imagined, we are already within the scene of the humanities, executing its basic task. Perhaps the question of how we can imagine the future of the humanities turns into a different question. How can the humanities imagine the future? Is the humanities in the business of imagining the future, or should it be? Is that one of its basic social obligations, ones that ideally ought to be realized within the university? Or is it a question that comes from life outside the university and is registered within its walls and comes to redefine the walls of the university? For to ask the question about the future, what can still be imagined, and through what means, we accept that the university is facing an historical time, an historical crisis, and that the historical times press against those walls and demand that the university open its mind, as it were, to the public world. A university faces inward and outward. Its walls are porous, penetrated by windows and doors, and no matter how closed off a university seeks to be, its aims are challenged by its architectural opening to the public world. When we imagine the humanities, we are also considering forms of imagination, literary, visual, digital, archival, that constitute the medium and the work of the humanities. And if we are speaking about imagining, then we cannot separate the humanities from the arts, for they belong together, whether we are thinking about the arts of writing or thinking, the form of the essay, the mode of communication for thought itself. The form is not external to the thought. The thought demands a form that it sometimes can achieve and other times fails to achieve. Perhaps we are thinking of the humanities and the arts as autonomous domains, as nothing other than established fields within institutional locations. Of course, we do think that way. And in a time when language and literature programs are underfunded, sometimes closed, and sometimes merged without any consideration of the intellectual costs of losing autonomy, there are many reasons to affirm the distinct and autonomous achievement of the humanities. And yet, reflections on science, on economics, and politics all require the humanities, language and image, modes of communication and persuasion, ways of crafting and communicating the results of an inquiry, but also translation in a world in which English is increasingly accepted as the language of the market, including the academic market. Within the digital humanities, the question is not just how digital technology can be of use to literary studies or art history, although that is an important question. There is a corollary question, however, which is whether the digital and the field of data has to be read and interpreted before it becomes of use. Does it present itself as a useful instrument, or must that instrumentality be derived through acts of interpretation? My thesis is that it is not possible to replace acts of interpretation with facts or data or evidence without first interpreting the field of sensible experience. In all of these fields, we must read to understand. We must listen to what is said. We must be involved in an acoustic environment to register what is happening. We must, in other words, rely upon the senses to know whether the abstractions upon which we settle are true, and we must understand how those abstractions bear the trace of their sensuous origins. Let me make this point in a more emphatic way. Even when we traffic with abstract formulations and abstract philosophy, we are still bodies in the world, attending to what is presented, responsive to what is communicated. And that responsiveness has a value that tells us something about what it is to be a body in the world, endeavoring to exist in this life. Whoever the knowing subject may be, it is someone who exists and is endeavoring to exist, and that endeavor is part of the practice of knowledge. Whoever that knowing subject may be, it will be someone located somewhere with a history, a sense of time, burdened by the weight of the past, someone who imagines a future in some way. There are, of course, many skeptical arguments against the humanities. They are considered a luxury or useless, or they are somehow the property of intellectual elites. Those views fail, however, to understand how stories work to give us a sense of how actions link to consequences, how poems work to take apart the usual concepts we bring to our everyday world, how images work to register a reality at the level of the senses and to give it sense. We cannot apprehend our world without the humanities. And the humanities, including philosophy, literature, and religion, are at once departments or compartments within the university, and so enclosed in a space. At the same time, they defy those enclosures by which they are contained. They spill out into the world spills into those spaces. They always exceed whatever contains them. A literary scholar works within the norms, and yet at a certain point, those norms, those genres, those conventions can come into crisis. They enforce an official history, or they exclude marginal voices. And then scholarship becomes critical. Well, what is meant by critical? Critical scholarship calls into question the norms and conventions that have governed how we think and what we write, what can be published and what can be communicated. So the most innovative academic disciplines begin as marginal or even as unacceptable knowledge, knowledge on the periphery, debased or rejected knowledge, the refuse, as it were, that comes back to inhabit the halls of the academy. Feminist scholarship, queer and trans studies, decolonial studies, indigenous epistemology, post-colonial reflections, Black studies, and all those embodied forms of intellectual engagement, including performance art, that acknowledges that the subject of knowing is existing in a body, as a body, and that knowledge can be a form of persistence. Knowledge can pursue the question, how best to persist in this world, a question not just for an individual to answer, but for all of us. In the university, those who study the humanities are studying many fields, but what they are doing is seeking to exist and persist in a world in which their lives may not be fully represented or even fully thinkable. The humanities are not a luxury. Without them, we would not be able to reflect upon our world in a critical way, nor would we be able to imagine the world as a different kind of time and place. And yet, time and again, we see the power of fiction, philosophy, and film to call down the powers of censorship. It is as if the power of imagination is closed down from a set of fears. According to those who would censor, we should not be able to question the social, political, and economic conditions of our lives. Are they just? Are they making our lives more livable? Are they making our lives less livable? We should not be able to ask what allows the earth to be sustained, equality to be affirmed, and social transformation to work in the direction of greater knowledge, accountability, and social justice. As we know, under certain conditions, intellectual inquiry can itself become regarded as a criminal act, an attack on society, the family, the state. This happens not only when academics or intellectuals voice criticisms of the state, as has happened in Turkey, where petitioners for peace lost their jobs and their countries, or in China, where a critique of the state and its surveillance mechanisms have landed law professors in prison, or in India, where those who criticized the caste system and Hindu nationalism have found themselves in courts of law. In all of these cases, it is the political freedom of the dissident that is actively suppressed. But what about those who seek to study gender, or to represent women within feminist frameworks, or who inquire into the various possible formations of family and kinship outside the heterosexual framework, or improvised as a consequence of migration? It would appear that the heterosexual family secures not just the meaning of masculinity, but its presumed dominance in a relationship with women and the natural character of that hierarchy. The critique of that notion involves rethinking the meanings of what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, and what it is to fall outside those binary categories. All of that is the critical work of gender. Anybody who asks the question, how can I be a better man, is asking a question about gender. Which version of gender do I wish to inhabit? Some ethical question, how do I be a better man? Well, to do that, one must revise one's idea of manhood. Manhood must therefore be revisable, right? That's the thought. So important to our sense of ethic is this notion of the changeability, revisability. How am I permitted to live as a woman? Well, in some ways, the category of gender changes if I wish to work or love in some way that does not conform with established categories. The critique of social hierarchies that enforce inequality and exploitation, that too is the work of critique the critique of gender and power, and of those who live outside the traditional categories of gender and family seek to live in freedom, to live out their desires and their relationships without being ostracized, subject to violence, or criminalized. That is also a practice in which critique is embodied as an affirmative mode of life. When feminist theory argued for a gap, a distinction between sex and gender, they sought to create an opening for freedom, but not a freedom or a power that sought to mimic the divine. No, this was a freedom that was importantly embodied, bound up with the desire to find the conditions in which life and breath and movement is possible. Such a freedom is never separable from an historical world packed with norms, expectations, and incitations about what gender means and how it should be lived. As a critical thought and practice, gender theories open up possibilities for thought, but they do not prescribe sexual conduct or gender embodiment, and neither do they seek to destroy existing family structures. They just want to live side by side. The normative principles that guide the inquiry tend to include the opposition to inequality, to the unjust loss of freedom, to racism, sexism, trans, and homophobia. The censorship and prohibition of gender as an academic field, a theory or a social movement, is itself an effort to restrain people, especially young people, from exercising freedom. It seeks to keep unthinkable and unimaginable the idea of gender diversity, and to banish from one's thoughts and one's imagination, one's books, films, and cultural life, the thought of human sexual variation and the complex relation of gender to a livable embodied life. As we know, to be able to think freely expands one's ability to judge well, and that educational precept is not the same as indoctrination. Gender is not a single concept, but an internally complex field that allows us to imagine and affirm modes of embodied freedom that dissent from the prevailing and traditional norms, but do not, for that reason, seek to destroy them. I began today by suggesting that the walls of the academy must be porous, and that as much as academic institutions face inward to refine their disciplines and fields, they must also face the public world and recognize that they are always already within that world. Critique, I suggested, is not simply a subjective practice, and certainly not an act of negation or destruction. When we ask how thinking and writing and artistic expression reflects upon the world, we are also asking what kind of transformation of the world is imagined or enacted by thinking and writing and art. That transformation is not one that would impose a totalitarian view of how the world should be on the world as it already is. No, it would simply license a form of imagining, a way of thinking about the future in which we might rethink and revalue what we mean by freedom, equality, and justice. Movements for social transformation very often produce intellectual problems for the academy, and the academy sometimes furnishes ideas or concepts that inspire those who seek to elaborate and defend basic freedoms for those who live under authoritarian constraint, for those who suffer from discrimination and dispossession, for those who lack basic justice, or those who have been subject to harm or have undergone political losses brought about through forms of state violence. It is in the academy that we start to formulate a concept of rights that goes beyond the human, includes the animal, and belongs as well to the environment, to the land, to the sea, as safeguards against expropriation and destruction by corporate greed and unregulated capitalism. In the humanities, we are very often concerned with imaginary worlds. They're not quite the same as the world we live in every day, but they do maintain a crucial, if not critical, relation to our lives, to the task of persisting and flourishing as these embodied beings. Although the worlds built by fictional works and the worlds in which we live are not the same, although perhaps my president doesn't make that distinction, we are surely living when we are reading fictional works, and sometimes when we read, we come alive in a new way, or the world is illuminated in a way we have never seen before. The text solicits us, and we give ourselves over to a world with new and unknown coordinates. We undergo a displacement in and by what is foreign. The foreign is actually the medium in which we live, the enigmatic basis of our worldly connection with one another. The foreign is our work if we work in other languages or in comparative literature. We are expanding our understanding of global history and culture as we come to know the multilingual expanse of this world. Translation is thus crucial to the future of the humanities, and this fact has implications for global cohabitation and mutual understanding. The task, at least within the humanities, working across several languages, is never to block or to displace or to deport what is foreign, but rather to allow what we call a foreign language, which is always someone else's first language, to claim our attention, knowing that our own language is foreign as well, compelling others to dislocate themselves in order to enter its terms. In a way, every language is, by definition, a foreign language. We depart from the usual coordinates of space and time only to be dropped back into our own world, disoriented and oriented anew. How many of the world's inhabitants would become more capable of living in a complex world if they were reading literature in this way? In comparative literary work, we can sometimes let the national framework come apart in order to make connections across borders and histories, in order to produce the multilingual constellation that allows for new connections, disputing and dissipating cultural arrogance and the smug insistence on the nation state as the only framework for what we read. We rely on translations all the time, and we make our own, or we struggle in the original. Translation is a gift to the world. It allows a book to move across linguistic boundaries and to open up the horizons of the languages between which it moves. Translation is not just what we do in all our classes. It gives form to an ethical aspiration to live at the crossroads of languages, to live in a multilingual world, no matter how difficult the impasses we may find. Of course, yes, translation can bring us to an impasse. At first, a foreign language sounds like noise. It cannot be assimilated into what we already understand. So many of you who have learned English as a second language know this well, as do those of you who had to lose your mastery in English to enter into another language. But if we refuse to learn another language, then we remain within the closed horizons of monolingualism, thinking that the limits of our own specific language are the limits of sense, of rationality, of culture. And that is a terrible error, and it narrows the horizon of the world. One has to have patience with what first appears as foreign and enigmatic. Let it slowly unmoor you from your certainties. Translation brings sorrow along with new connection. Something of the original is lost, even irretrievable. The Brazilian poet Cecilia Meirelles once wrote that pain is like a foreign language. Actually, the full line translated from the Portuguese is this: I feel the world's pain is like a foreign language. That pain is there, inaccessible, and yet the I feels it. I wonder, could we not write the same line for joy? I feel the world's joy is like a foreign language. An encounter in which we lose ourselves in what we do not know in order to emerge transformed and strengthened by the ways of knowing opened by another language, another literature, another cultural framework for making sense. In this way, there is always a risk involved in the transformations prompted by literature and by the humanities and the arts. as we see migrants stopped at the border, new walls built, and xenophobic rhetoric flooding political discourse, we might then pause and ask again, as if for the first time, what does it mean to read? To imagine otherwise, to hold on to the notion of what is still possible in the face of impasse, to hope still in the midst of realistic despair, precisely because one is, for the moment, held by the book, the work of art that reopens onto the world in a critical way. That is, in a way that is at once situated, thoughtful, engaged, probing, and affirmative. Historically speaking, this is not a time to shut down into our separate worlds, but to find a way to affirm our cohabitation on this earth and to affirm the earth that allows for this cohabitation. The humanities allows us to do this, as does philosophy and social criticism, and it provides the vital connection among us that exceeds every border and keeps thought alive for those who are asking how to live now in this world and with one another. Thank you.